We begin our program with the push by some Western allies to ramp up military aid to Ukraine. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin arrived in Germany ahead of a crucial meeting on Friday. Western defense officials are gathering there to discuss what to do next. Top of the agenda, tanks. Several European countries have signaled they want to send main battle tanks to Ukraine. But Germany, which is a large manufacturer, has to give the green light first before any German-produced tanks are sent. And that country appears to have some reservations. Still, the United Kingdom is pushing ahead with a transfer of its own tanks, sending an entire squadron. Britain's top diplomat made a special visit to Canada, and he joined Power and Politics for an exclusive interview. Here's part one of my conversation with UK Foreign Secretary James Cleverly. Secretary Cleverly, thank you very much for speaking with us. I'd like to start about this conversation on some of the conversations you've been having with high-level Canadian officials on this trip. And I'm curious, what specifically are you asking of Canada when it comes to additional support for Ukraine?
Well, Katie, thank you. I've come here to have an extended series of conversations with my Canadian counterpart, Melanie Joly, and we've discussed a whole range of issues. Obviously, because of what's happening in Ukraine, our collective response to Russia's attempted invasion has been a dominant topic of conversation. I'm very proud that the UK and Canada have worked very, very closely supporting Ukraine, both in terms of providing military and economic aid, and of course hosting Ukrainian refugees. The UK is stepping up its military support to Ukraine, and I've been speaking with Melanie Joly and other friends and allies about coordinating our efforts to make sure that we give the Ukrainians the tools that they need to get the job done. Got a very, very positive response to the announcements that the UK made earlier this week, and we'll continue to coordinate with our NATO colleagues and allies about what more we all need to do to ensure that this Russian invasion is unsuccessful and that the Ukrainians prevailed in the defense of their homeland.
Okay, so you dropped a number of hints in that answer. You talked about coordinating efforts. You made a big announcement that you just referenced earlier this week about sending tanks into Ukraine. Did you ask Canada to prepare to send tanks into Ukraine?
Well, of course, we did discuss the provision of tanks, both what we have done and what conversations might be had at the meeting at Ramstein in Germany, where NATO allies will come together to discuss what more military aid we can give to Ukraine. But it's worth remembering that there is a lot more to military support to Ukraine than just tanks. Canada has already announced its commitment to purchase air defense systems for Ukraine, providing armored vehicles, hundreds of armored vehicles for Ukraine, as well as Canadian members of the armed forces in the UK working with NATO allies, training Ukrainian soldiers in the equipment that we will be providing for them. So Canada and UK, unsurprisingly, working shoulder to shoulder in supporting Ukraine, because we recognise that this is not just about the defence of Ukraine, this is about the defence of the UN Charter, about territorial integrity and international law.
But just to drill down on this specifically, did you ask Canada to follow suit and prepare to send tanks to Ukraine? That is, if Germany gives the green light for German-manufactured tanks to be sent.
Well, we discussed the provision of military aid. We discussed what kind of things the Ukrainians need. And look, this isn't us about the UK kind of trying to push our friends, partners, and colleagues. We are absolutely on the same page with the importance of supporting Ukraine. We coordinate our efforts to make sure that we're not all providing the same thing and inadvertently creating gaps in the Ukrainian military capabilities. So this is about coordination amongst allies, amongst friends, to make sure that we most effectively support Ukraine in their self-defense.
Okay, tanks aside, and I know that came up in the conversation as you mentioned, but is there anything specific you think Canada could contribute that Canada has not contributed yet?
Well, look, this question is kind of inviting me to be critical of a country that has done incredibly important work. Just yesterday, I was at a Ukrainian Orthodox cathedral in downtown Toronto. I met Ukrainian refugees who have come here to Canada, who have been hosted incredibly generously by Canada, and they were incredibly grateful, not just for the work that UK and Canada has done in military aid, but in terms of hosting them, in terms of supporting them economically in their country economically, in terms of helping them defend themselves against Russian invasion. Of course, we all ask ourselves every day, what more can we do? What more can, how else can we help? How can we bring this conflict to a successful conclusion as quickly as possible? That's the right thing to do. But I would not want in any way anyone to interpret my conversations with the Canadian government as anything other than good friends and close colleagues exploring how we can do even more still.
No, and fair enough, but I don't necessarily think it invites a critical answer. I think it just opens up a conversation in this country about what are the options going forward. And I was curious, since your country has really taken a lead in terms of the tanks situation, and because Canada and the UK and the US and other NATO allies are pretty much aligned on this, I was just curious as to whether there's something more, something next we should be looking at. What's the conversation? Where does this conversation go next?
Well, okay, that is a good way of thinking about this. And the simple truth is, we don't know exactly what's going to be needed in the future. We will always continue our conversations with Ukraine, but our support, our military support to the Ukrainians, has evolved as this conflict has evolved. So in the start, when it was a defensive battle in and around Kyiv and other major cities against Russian tanks, those anti-tank missile systems, those Javelin missiles, those NLAW missiles were absolutely instrumental in ensuring Ukraine could defend itself against that initial attack. Then air defense systems became the thing that the Ukrainians needed the most. Then the ability to repair their energy and water infrastructure became the priority. And increasingly now we're looking at heavy battlefield armor, both tanks and artillery. So their requirement evolves, our response evolves, and that evolution is done in close coordination with our friends and allies across NATO.
Speaking of NATO, Canada has not consistently, or it hasn't in decades, met that NATO requirement of spending more than 2% of GDP on defense spending. I'm not inviting a criticism here, but I am curious, do you think it's time for Canada to step up and meet that funding target?
Well, I think what we have seen in response to Russia's attempted invasion of Ukraine is all NATO member states taking a look at what more we need to do to protect ourselves from this current situation and other emerging threats. I'm very proud of the fact that the UK is one of the NATO member states that consistently spends above 2% of GDP. And of course, we would encourage all member states of NATO to do likewise. But this is something which has been a long-standing position of the UK and a conversation we have with a wide range of NATO member states. It's also worth recognising that Vladimir Putin was hoping to fracture NATO as a defensive alliance, and instead what we've seen is NATO coming together and two new countries applying to join NATO as a direct response to Russia's attempted invasion of Ukraine.
There is one question that is coming out of conversations in the United States and the change in power. Republicans have taken control of the House, and early on they have signaled that perhaps the United States will not continue to fund support for Ukraine in the way it has when Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate, and of course the White House. They spoke about limits to how much the United States would be willing to spend. I know that the Biden administration is trying to assure allies that the spending will continue to be there. The United States is still very much supportive of this. But from your perspective, is there any sort of limit here when it comes to the amount of spending that allies are willing to do? Do you have a conversation about what the limit is?
Well, I did speak about the enduring requirement to support Ukraine when I went to the United States of America earlier this week. Of course, I had this conversation with Secretary Tony Blinken at the State Department. And the point that I made when I was in America was that we have made a commitment to support the Ukrainians until they are successful in defending their homeland against this Russian attempted invasion. And if we fail to do so, then the signal that we would send to every potential aggressor anywhere in the world is that we don't have the patience, we don't have the strategic endurance to stick with this until the job is done. And I think that would make the world a much more dangerous place and far more costly in human lives as well as in money. So the right thing to do, the morally right thing to do, and indeed the economically right thing to do, is to support Ukraine until it has successfully defended itself against this attempted invasion. Now that may well mean that we have to intensify the support, as we have done in the United Kingdom. But if we fail to do so, it will be far, far, far more costly in terms of both money and lives. And that is why this is just the morally right thing to do, but it's also the economically right thing to do, the pragmatically right thing to do.
That was part one of my conversation with the British Foreign Secretary. In part two, I ask about the UK's security pact with the US and Australia and whether he thinks Canada should ever be included. That's next. Russia's war on Ukraine has shaken global security. Now Japan and Taiwan are ringing the alarm about the growing threat of China in the Indo-Pacific. Taiwan's foreign minister says Beijing is taking lessons from Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
I think what the Chinese are learning from is the weakness of the Russian military so that they can strengthen themselves in their future possible attack against Taiwan.
I asked Britain's top diplomat on whether he thinks the Western response to Russia's war on Ukraine is having any impact on President Xi Jinping and his thoughts on Taiwan. Here's part two of my exclusive interview.
Well, look, I want to broaden this out because I think there will be people watching what's happening here right across the world, and they will be interpreting our actions. And we need to make sure that the message that we send to anybody who is watching is that we defend the concept of territorial integrity, that we defend the rule of law, that we defend the UN Charter. These things are fundamental and they have kept us safe for decades. And I would want to make sure that anybody witnessing our response to Russia's attempted invasion of Ukraine understands how strongly the international community, the UK and Canada and our friends and allies, how strongly we take these issues. And I think that's something that we need to make sure we broadcast to anyone and everybody that is watching these events.
On the challenge that China poses in the Indo-Pacific, the UK, the US and Australia formed the Trilateral Security Pact called AUKUS. Many in this country were surprised that Canada was not included. I heard your answer yesterday where you talked about submarines, but I'm just very curious. This is a more broad pact. I'm curious whether you see a role for Canada in that pact moving forward.
Well, yeah, as I said, and for those viewers who didn't pick up my answer at the press conference yesterday, it's worth remembering that AUKUS specifically was about the provision of nuclear-powered but conventionally armed submarines. Which
yes,
is
but it's also with respect, so it's also a broader. It's also broader than that, right?
So that is the core deliverable through the AUKUS agreement that the UK, the US, and Australia has made, and that's a capability that Canada was not looking to acquire. But addressing the broader point that you made. I read with interest the Indo-Pacific strategy that Minister Joly published just at the tail end of last year. Unsurprisingly, it is very, very similar in tone and aspiration to the strategic document that the UK published, including our tilt to the Indo-Pacific. So it is very, very clear that the UK, Canada, Australia, the United States of America all share many of the same interests and desires for peace and security in the Indo-Pacific region. It is inevitable that we will work increasingly closely on these issues in that region. As I say, Canada and the UK share a huge number of principles and values, and that's one of the things that I explored with Foreign Minister Joly when we spoke yesterday.
But specifically, do you see Canada joining this pact at some time?
Well, look, that will ultimately be a conversation that we need to have at government-to-government levels. As I say, it's inevitable that we're going to work more closely on defence.
Is it something that Minister Joly said that Canada wants to do? That Canada wants to get into that pact?
So we discussed a range of ways. We didn't go into the specifics as to what vehicle is best to protect our respective interests in the Indo-Pacific, but of course we discussed how we would continue to work closely together. We are strong defence partners. We are members of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network. So we are close. I mean, I kind of half jokingly said that whilst the UK and the US are strong and close partners, the UK and Canada, we're family. So of course we want to make sure that the Canadians feel safe and secure, and we will inevitably work with Canada and other international partners on protecting defence and security in the region.
To sort of flip that conversation and question on its head, is there anything that Canada offers that would enhance that pact?
Well, of course. I mean, Canada is an important NATO friend and ally, as I say, part of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network, a country which has a real authority and voice on the world stage, and it has a voice which very much echoes the principles and philosophies that the UK holds dear. So Canada is an important bilateral friend and ally, and a very significant player in that defence and security space through organisations such as NATO. So it's inevitable that we're going to explore ways of doing more together because we're so naturally and regularly aligned on these big issues.
I hate to go at this one more time, but specifically, does that include bringing Canada into that pact? Do you see it?
Look, I don't want to just be hooked up on that particular way of working more closely. It may well be the case that we explore ways of integrating Canada into that. There may well be other ways of doing that. I don't want to get overly specific on the vehicle that we use for this, but the broader point is Canada is an important partner. It is a very, very closely aligned partner to the UK and other member states of NATO. It, of course, has an interest in the Indo-Pacific, and we will, of course, therefore keep exploring ways of adding to what is already an incredibly important and close partnership.
Yesterday, you said the Iranian regime resorts to terror and violence on a daily basis. Are you pushing for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to be listed as a terrorist entity in the UK?
Well, the point that I made in Westminster just before I flew across the Atlantic this week was that the behaviour of the Iranian regime is unacceptable. We have put wide-ranging sanctions against the IRGC, very specific sanctions against individuals, including now sanctioning the Prosecutor General, who was instrumental in the execution of a British-Iranian dual national over the weekend. And we will keep exploring what else we can do to deter Iranian behaviour that is wrong and we oppose, but also to hold people to account who have been instrumental in the persecution of the Iranian people and the funding, for example, of armed militias in the region, and indeed the provision of military drones to Russia, which are being used to attack civilian targets in Ukraine. We will keep exploring what more we will do. I don't want to speculate as to what else we might do next. I don't always think that's, I rarely think that is helpful, but the Iranian regime should understand they will be held accountable for the actions that they have taken.
I get that you're not at this point ready to say one way or the other what your next steps are, but this is a conversation that's also happening in Canada. If the UK moves in this direction, do you think that this is something that Canada should also follow suit on?
Well, look, and again, I maybe sound like a bit of a broken record, but in a positive way. The UK and Canada are very, very closely aligned on the areas that we feel strongly about. We talk about in the UK, we're very much committed to the protection of women on the international stage, particularly the groundbreaking work that we've done in preventing sexual violence in conflict. We see the persecution of women in Iran, the subjugation of women in Iran, and the brutal repression of those female protesters, those incredibly courageous women who want nothing more than to be able to live their lives in peace. And when we say these things, guess what? It is absolutely in lockstep with the position that Canada takes on these issues. We value their friendship and partnership on these issues, and we will inevitably work closely in the coordination of things like our sanctions response and also calling out Iran on the world stage, as we both did recently by ejecting Iran from the Women's Committee at the United Nations.
Because we don't get this opportunity very often to speak with you directly, I'm just curious, is there anything else you think the people of Canada need to know about the ongoing relationship between Canada and the US that we did not, or in the UK, that we did not cover in this conversation, that you think would make some news and be of value to Canadians?
Well, look, I think that look, if I'm going to be self-critical, I think one of the challenges that we've had with the bilateral relationship with Canada is we don't shout about it enough. We don't celebrate it enough, and I think it's because it's such an easy kind of natural sympathetic relationship. We reinforce each other so often on the world stage. Our two countries recently stood shoulder to shoulder in sadness as we had the funeral of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth, our respective or our joint head of state. And so for me, one of the things that I would want to do is perhaps shout more about how closely we work together, how closely aligned we are, and how much great work we do together on the world stage. Because sometimes when a relationship is so close and so so closely aligned, we forget to shout about it, we forget to celebrate it. So Katie, next time I come on the show, if you think that I haven't celebrated the bilateral relationship enough, please feel free to tell me off, because that's going to be part of my project going forward.
All right, Secretary Cleverly, thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much.